I found the citation taped to the overturned lemonade stand at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. The pitcher of lukewarm lemonade spilled across the sidewalk in a sticky yellow river that was already attracting wasps. My kids were sitting on the curb, Nalan with his head between his knees and Priya crying silently the way she'd learned to cry after her mother died, with her hand pressed over her mouth like she was afraid to take up too much space in the world. The paper fluttered in the June breeze, official HOA letterhead with the Meadowbrook Estates logo printed across the top, and the words that made my blood pressure spike were typed in bold. Notice of violation. Unlicensed commercial enterprise in residential zone. I pulled the citation free and read it twice, certain I was misunderstanding something fundamental about reality itself. According to the document, my 10-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter had violated Section 7.3.2 of the Community Covenants by operating a business without board approval, and the violation carried a $200 fine payable within 14 days. There was a handwritten note at the bottom in sharp, aggressive cursive. Children must learn to respect community standards. This behavior reflects poorly on the entire neighborhood. Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. Dad, we're sorry, Nalan said, his voice muffled against his knees. We didn't know we were doing something wrong. I crouched down beside them, the citation crumpling in my fist. You didn't do anything wrong. You were selling lemonade for 50 cents a cup. That's what kids do in summer. Mrs. Whitmore said we were running an illegal business, Priya whispered, and a fresh tear tracked down her cheek. She said she was going to call the police if we didn't shut down immediately. She knocked over the table herself, Dad. She just pushed it over and the pitcher broke and everything spilled. The anger that rose in my chest was the hot, protective kind that made my hands shake. Patricia Whitmore had been a thorn in my side since my wife Sarah died 18 months ago, always finding some new violation to cite me for, whether it was my grass being a quarter-inch too tall or my garbage cans visible from the street for 15 minutes past the allowed time on collection day. I tried to be understanding, tried to remember that some people just needed to feel important and in control, but this crossed a line I hadn't known existed. Go inside and get cleaned up, I told the kids, keeping my voice steady. We're going to handle this. Are we in trouble? Nalan asked, finally looking up at me with Sarah's gray eyes. No, buddy. You're not in trouble, not even a little bit. After I got them inside and distracted with snacks and television, I sat at the kitchen table with the citation spread in front of me and my laptop open. As a paralegal at Morrison & Chen, I'd spent the last 7 years helping people navigate legal systems that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate ordinary citizens. I knew how to read governing documents, how to spot violations of procedure, how to find the gaps between what people claimed as authority and what authority they actually possessed. If Patricia Whitmore wanted to play this game with my children, I was more than prepared to play back. I started with the Meadowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The dense document I'd signed when Sarah and I bought the house 6 years ago, back when we'd been excited about the good schools and the neighborhood pool, and the future we thought we had stretching out ahead of us. Section 7.3.2 did indeed prohibit commercial enterprises without board approval, but the language was clearly intended for things like home-based businesses, in-home salons, and contractor offices. The idea that it applied to a children's lemonade stand was absurd on its face, the kind of interpretation that could only come from someone determined to find a violation no matter how far they had to stretch. I pulled up the Kansas statutes next, searching for any regulations about minor children and commercial activity. What I found instead was Kansas Statute 364525, which specifically exempted occasional sales by minors from business licensing requirements, with explicit mention of lemonade stands, bake sales, and similar activities. The law had been passed 2 years ago after a case in Topeka, where an overzealous code enforcement officer had shut down a kid's lemonade stand, sparking enough outrage that the legislature actually did something useful for once. So, Patricia Whitmore wasn't just being petty. She was factually wrong, citing authority she didn't have to punish children for doing something that was explicitly legal. I screenshotted the statute, added it to a new folder on my desktop labeled Meadowbrook HOA, and started drafting a response letter that was professional and restrained and probably a lot kinder than she deserved. I was 3 paragraphs in when my phone rang, an unknown local number that I almost didn't answer. But old paralegal habits die hard, and you never know when a call might be important, so I picked up. "Is this Marcus Young?" a woman's voice asked, crisp and businesslike, speaking. "This is Patricia Whitmore, HOA president for Meadowbrook Estates. I'm calling to follow up on the violation notice your children received today." I took a slow breath through my nose, counting to 3 before I responded. "I was just reviewing that notice, actually." "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Young. Your children were operating a commercial enterprise without board approval. The rules are very clear. Mrs. Whitmore, they were selling lemonade." Kansas law specifically exempts children's lemonade stands from commercial licensing requirements under Statute 364525. HOA covenants supersede state law in matters of community governance, she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the pleasure of someone who thought they'd found a trump card. That's not actually how it works. Covenants can't violate state law, and they can't be interpreted in a way that conflicts with explicit statutory exemptions. The board has already voted to uphold the citation. The fine stands. If you wish to contest it, you can request a hearing, but I should warn you that we take these matters very seriously. Perhaps if you spent more time supervising your children and less time looking for loopholes, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The jab about supervision landed exactly where she'd aimed it, right in the guilt and grief I carried about raising 2 kids alone, about being both mother and father to children who'd already lost too much. I felt my jaw tighten, felt the response I wanted to give rising hot in my throat, but I swallowed it back. "I'll be submitting a formal response to the citation," I said instead. "And I'll be requesting a full accounting of the board's authority to levy fines under the governing documents." "You do that, Mr. Young. The fine is due in 14 days. She hung up before I could respond. I set the phone down on the table and stared at the citation again, at Patricia Whitmore's handwritten note about community standards and poor reflection. Something about the whole interaction sat wrong with me, something beyond the obvious petness and overreach. In my experience, people who grabbed for power this aggressively usually had something to hide, some reason they needed to keep everyone else off balance and defensive. I opened a new search window and typed in Meadowbrook Estates HOA meeting minutes. The association was required by Kansas law to maintain records and make them available to homeowners, though in practice, most people never bothered to look at them. I'd certainly never looked before, too busy with work and kids, and the daily overwhelm of keeping my family fed and clothed and emotionally functional. The HOA website was bare bones, just a contact form and a list of board members. No meeting minutes, no financial reports, no transparency of any kind. I tried searching for Meadowbrook Estates in the Johnson County property records, looking for any filed documents or public notices. What I found instead made me sit up straighter in my chair. There were 3 liens filed against properties in Meadowbrook Estates in the last 18 months, all for unpaid special assessment fees, in amounts ranging from $3,000 to $7,500. I recognized 2 of the addresses as houses just a few streets over, families I knew casually from school functions and neighborhood gatherings. One of the liens had resulted in foreclosure. The house sold at auction 6 months ago. Special assessments weren't unusual in HOAs. They were how communities paid for major repairs or improvements that exceeded the normal operating budget. Things like repaving roads or replacing a clubhouse roof. But they required proper notice, homeowner votes, and strict adherence to the governing documents. They couldn't just be levied at will by the board. I pulled up the Meadowbrook covenants again and searched for special assessment. The language was clear. Special assessments required a majority vote of the board, written notice to all homeowners 30 days in advance, a detailed explanation of the purpose and amount, and a right to petition for a full homeowner vote if 20% of residents objected. For assessments over $5,000, a full homeowner vote was mandatory, not optional. I had never received notice of any special assessment. I scrolled through my email, searching for anything from the HOA, and found only the monthly reminders about dues and the occasional notice about pool hours or trash collection schedule changes. Nothing about special assessments, nothing about votes, nothing about major expenditures or improvements. But according to the county records, the HOA had filed liens for non-payment of these fees, which meant they were claiming the authority to levy them. I pulled up my bank statements and checked my automatic HOA payments. The monthly dues had stayed consistent at $150, the same amount Sarah and I had been paying since we moved in. No special assessments, no additional fees, so why were some homeowners being charged thousands of dollars while others weren't? I spent the next 2 hours going down a rabbit hole, cross-referencing property records with the neighborhood directory, trying to map out who had been hit with special assessment liens and who hadn't. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Every single lien had been filed against homeowners who had filed complaints with the board or contested violations. The Hendersons on Oak Street had fought a citation for their fence height. The Patels on Birch had objected to a fine for parking their car in their own driveway overnight. The Kowalskis on Maple had requested financial records after questioning the budget at an annual meeting. Each of them had been hit with special assessment fees within 6 months of their complaints. Each of them had been given 30 days to pay. And at least one of them had lost their home because of it. I sat back from the computer, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just petty HOA tyranny. This was systematic retaliation using fabricated fees, and it might constitute fraud, embezzlement, or both. The amounts were too large to be legitimate special assessments for actual improvements, especially since I couldn't find any record of major work being done in the neighborhood. The streets were the same patched asphalt they'd always been. The clubhouse still had the same aging roof. The playground equipment was original to the development. So where was the money going? I checked the clock and saw it was almost 7. The kids needed dinner, and I needed to think about something other than HOA corruption for a minute. But I saved everything I'd found to the Meadowbrook HOA folder and made a note to dig deeper tomorrow. If Patricia Whitmore wanted to come after my kids, she just picked a fight with the wrong paralegal. Dinner was chicken nuggets and carrot sticks, comfort food that required minimal effort and generated minimal complaints. Nalan pushed his carrots around his plate without eating them, and Priya was quieter than usual, her eyes distant in that way that meant she was thinking about her mom. We'd had a lot of quiet dinners in the 18 months since Sarah's car accident, a lot of meals where grief sat at the table with us like an unwelcome guest. "Are we really going to get in trouble with the HOA?" Nalan asked finally, breaking the silence. "No," I said firmly. "What happened today wasn't right and we're going to fix it." "Mrs. Whitmore was really mean," Priya said softly. "She said we were embarrassing the neighborhood and that people like us don't belong here." My hand tightened around my fork. "People like us." "I don't know what she meant," Priya said, looking down at her plate, "but the way she said it was mean." I put my fork down and reached across the table to take both of their hands. "Listen to me. You two did nothing wrong. Lemonade stands are a normal summer activity. You were being entrepreneurial and creative, and I'm proud of you. Mrs. Whitmore is the one who behaved badly, not you. Do you understand?" They both nodded, but I could see the doubt still lingering in their eyes, the way children internalize adult cruelty and turn it into questions about their own worth. It made me want to march over to Patricia Whitmore's house right then and explain exactly what I thought of adults who bullied children, but that wouldn't help anything. What would help was building an airtight case and taking her down the right way, the legal way, the way that would stick. After dinner and homework and bedtime stories, after I'd tucked both kids in and promised them that everything would be okay, I went back to my laptop and the growing folder of HOA documents. I needed more information, needed to see the actual financial records and meeting minutes that should have been available to all homeowners. Tomorrow, I'd submit a formal records request under Kansas law, which required HOAs to provide copies of all financial records, meeting minutes, and governing documents within 14 business days. But I also needed to talk to someone who understood consumer protection law and state regulatory authority. Someone who could tell me if what I was seeing added up to actual criminal activity or just aggressive HOA management. I pulled up the Kansas Attorney General's website and clicked through to the Consumer Protection Division, looking for information on how to file a complaint. What I found was a hotline number and an email address for reporting consumer fraud, along with a list of common scams and schemes the AG's office investigated. HOA disputes were mentioned specifically, particularly cases involving unauthorized fees, failure to maintain proper records, or retaliation against homeowners. I made a note to call in the morning, but I also saw that the AG's office had a dedicated consumer protection unit with paralegals and investigators who handled these cases. On impulse, I clicked through to the staff directory, looking for a name or contact for someone who specialized in HOA cases. The list was alphabetical, with email addresses and brief descriptions of each staff member's focus areas. I was about to give up when I saw a name that made me pause. Olivia Adams, Consumer Protection Paralegal, specializing in housing fraud, HOA disputes, and residential contract violations. Her email address was listed right there on the website. I opened a new message and started typing before I could talk myself out of it. "Miss Adams, my name is Marcus Young, and I'm a paralegal at Morrison & Chen in Overland Park. I'm writing to request guidance on what may be a case of systematic fraud and retaliation by my HOA. The immediate issue involves a citation against my minor children for operating a lemonade stand, in violation of Kansas Statute 364525. However, in researching the HOA's authority, I've discovered a pattern of unauthorized special assessment fees being levied against homeowners who challenge board decisions, with at least one foreclosure resulting from these fees. I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter with someone familiar with HOA regulations and consumer protection law. I've attached the citation, relevant statutes, and preliminary documentation of the special assessment liens. Thank you for your time and consideration. I attached the files, read the email twice, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. It was nearly 10 at night, so I didn't expect a response anytime soon, but at least I'd taken the first step toward escalating this beyond a personal dispute. If the AG's office saw merit in what I'd found, they had the resources and authority to investigate in ways I couldn't. I was shutting down my laptop when my phone buzzed with a new email notification. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam or a work message that could wait until morning, but something made me check. It was from Olivia Adams. The timestamp showed she'd sent it less than 5 minutes after receiving mine. Mr. Young, thank you for reaching out. I've reviewed your attachments, and this does raise some significant concerns. I'd like to discuss this further, preferably in person so I can see all of your documentation and get a fuller picture of the situation. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon? I have a gap in my schedule at 2 p.m. If you're able to come to the AG's office in Topeka, or I could meet you somewhere in Johnson County after 4 if that works better with your schedule. Olivia Adams. I stared at the email for a long moment, surprised by the quick response and the willingness to meet so soon. Most government offices moved at glacial speed, and I'd expected to wait weeks for any kind of follow-up. The fact that she'd responded within minutes suggested either she was a workaholic who checked email at all hours, or she'd seen something in what I'd sent that warranted immediate attention. I hit reply. Miss Adams, I appreciate your quick response. 2 p.m. in Topeka works for me. I'll bring all of my documentation and the HOA governing documents. Thank you for taking this seriously. Her response came back almost immediately. See you tomorrow, and call me Olivia. We're going to be working together on this. The casual tone was unexpected, but welcome. I'd dealt with enough government bureaucrats to appreciate someone who approached things like a human being instead of a walking regulation manual. I confirmed the address, added the appointment to my calendar, and finally shut down the laptop for the night. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind kept circling back to the image of Priya crying on the curb. Her hand pressed over her mouth like she was afraid to make too much noise in the world. That was what happened when you lost your mother at 7 years old, when you learned that the world could take away the person you loved most without warning or fairness. You learned to make yourself small, to not ask for too much, to apologize for existing. I'd spent 18 months trying to teach my kids that it was okay to take up space again, that they were allowed to be loud and messy and present in their own lives. And Patricia Whitmore had knocked over their lemonade stand and told them they didn't belong. Whatever I found in those HOA records, whatever fraud or corruption was hiding behind the special assessment fees, I was going to drag it into the light. Not just for my kids, but for every other homeowner who'd been bullied or threatened or forced out of their homes by people who thought a position on an HOA board gave them unlimited power. The next morning I called in sick to work, something I almost never did, and arranged for my neighbor Mrs. Chen to watch the kids after school. She was retired and had been a godsend since Sarah died, always willing to help with pickup or babysitting or just being an extra adult presence when I needed to handle things during business hours. HOA trouble. She asked when I explained I had a meeting in Topeka. How did you know? Patricia Whitmore has been making her rounds. She cited 3 families on our street last month for various violations. Most people just pay the fines rather than fight her. It's easier that way. Did she ever try to charge you a special assessment fee? I asked. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted, something wary crossing her face. Why do you ask? I found liens filed against some properties in the neighborhood. Large amounts, 5,000 and up, for special assessments. Did you ever get a notice about those? No, she said slowly. But the Hendersons did. That's why they lost their house. They couldn't afford to pay $7,000 out of nowhere, and the HOA wouldn't work out a payment plan. Just filed a lien and eventually forced a foreclosure. Did the Hendersons ever tell you what the assessment was for? Road repairs, according to Patricia. But our roads are still full of potholes, so I don't know what got repaired. I filed that information away with everything else I'd learned. If anyone from the HOA asks, I'm working today. I'd rather they not know I'm looking into this. Mrs. Chen nodded. Be careful, Marcus. Patricia Whitmore doesn't like being challenged, and she has a vindictive streak a mile wide. The drive to Topeka took an hour and 15 minutes, straight west on I-70 through rolling farmland and small towns. I prepared a 3-ring binder with every document I'd found, organized by category. The lemonade stand citation, the Kansas statute exempting children's sales, the HOA covenants, the special assessment liens from county records, and a timeline of violations and liens that showed the pattern of retaliation. If Olivia Adams was going to take this seriously, I wanted to make her job as easy as possible. The Attorney General's office was in a modern building near the Capitol, all glass and steel with security checkpoints in the lobby. I signed in, got a visitor badge, and was directed to the 3rd-floor Consumer Protection Division. The receptionist called back to let Olivia know I'd arrived, and within a minute, a woman emerged from a hallway to the left. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and warm brown eyes that looked genuinely friendly, despite the professional setting. She wore dress pants and a cardigan over a simple blouse, and she carried a legal pad and pen like they were natural extensions of her hands. Marcus Young, she asked, extending her hand. That's me. Thanks for meeting with me on such short notice. Of course. Come on back. I followed her down a hallway lined with offices, most of them small and cluttered with file boxes and legal references. Olivia's office was at the end of the hall, slightly larger than the others, with a window that looked out over downtown Topeka. Her desk was organized chaos, stacks of files arranged in what I assumed was a system that made sense to her, with post-it notes and highlighted pages marking important sections. Sorry about the mess, she said, gesturing to the guest chairs. I'm in the middle of about 6 cases right now, and the filing system is aspirational at best. I set my binder on her desk and sat down. I work in a law office. This is actually pretty tidy by comparison. She laughed, a genuine sound that immediately put me at ease. So, let's talk about your HOA. You mentioned in your email that they cited your kids for a lemonade stand. I walked her through the whole story, from finding the citation on the overturned stand to Priya crying on the curb to my phone call with Patricia Whitmore. Olivia took notes, asking clarifying questions about the exact wording of the citation and the HOA's justification for the fine. When I pulled out the Kansas statute exempting children's sales, she nodded. This is pretty clear-cut, she said. The HOA can't enforce a covenant in a way that violates state law. The citation should be dismissed, and honestly, they could be liable for damages if they actually tried to collect the fine. That's what I thought, I said, but that's not the main issue. The lemonade stand is what got my attention, but it's what I found when I started digging that really concerns me. I opened the binder to the section on special assessment liens and walked her through everything I'd discovered. The pattern of liens filed against homeowners who challenged the board, the amounts that seemed excessive for any legitimate assessment, the lack of notice or documentation about what the assessments were supposedly funding, and the complete absence of the required homeowner votes for assessments over $5,000. Olivia's expression grew more serious as I talked. She pulled the county records toward her and studied them closely, making notes on her legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against the desk. "This is more than just aggressive HOA management," she said. "If what you're showing me is accurate, and these assessments were levied without proper notice and voting procedures, that's fraud. If the board members personally benefited from the fees, that's embezzlement. And if they're targeting specific homeowners as retaliation, that's a whole separate issue." "Can the AG's office investigate this?" I asked. "We can, and based on what you've shown me, we should." HOA fraud is a growing problem in Kansas, and we've been trying to build cases that can set precedent and send a message. Your situation might be exactly what we need. She paused, studying me with those warm brown eyes. "But I need to be honest with you about what this process looks like. An investigation takes time. We'll need to subpoena records, interview homeowners, maybe even bring in forensic accountants if the financial trail gets complicated. This isn't going to be resolved in a week or even a month." "I understand," I said. "But if this HOA is doing what I think they're doing, every day they operate is another day they could be targeting someone else." "Agreed, which is why I want to move on this quickly." She pulled out a fresh legal pad and started writing. "Here's what I need from you. A formal written complaint with everything you've told me, copies of all your documentation, and a signed authorization allowing us to act on your behalf in dealing with the HOA. I'll also need contact information for any other homeowners who have been affected by these special assessments." "I don't have direct contact with most of them," I admitted. "Just county records and addresses." "That's fine. We can reach out to them ourselves. In the meantime, I want you to submit a formal records request to the HOA under Kansas Statute 584606. That requires them to provide copies of all financial records, meeting minutes, and governing documents within 14 business days. When they respond, bring everything to me. And if they don't respond, that's a violation in itself, and it gives us additional leverage. Either way, we win." She tore off the top sheet of her legal pad and handed it to me. "This is my direct line and personal cell. Call me if anything else happens, if the HOA retaliates in any way, or if you find additional information. I mean it, Marcus, day or night." I took the paper, surprised by the personal nature of the offer. "You give your cell number to everyone you work with?" "Only the cases I think are important," she said, and there was something in her expression that felt like more than professional interest, though maybe I was reading into things. "And only to people I trust to use it responsibly." I left the AG's office with a clear next steps list, and a feeling that I'd found an ally who actually cared about holding the HOA accountable. The drive back to Johnson County felt faster than the drive out. My mind occupied with drafting the formal records request and planning how to approach other affected homeowners without tipping off Patricia Whitmore that I was building a case. I picked up the kids from Mrs. Chen's house at 5:30, and they were in better spirits than they'd been the day before. Nalan was excited about a science project at school, and Priya had spent the afternoon baking cookies with Mrs. Chen. For a few hours, we pretended everything was normal, eating leftover pizza and watching a movie together on the couch. The three of us squeezed together the way we'd learned to be in the months after Sarah died. But after they went to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and drafted the formal records request. I kept the language professional but firm, citing the specific Kansas statute that gave me the right to access the records and requesting everything from the last 5 years. Financial statements, bank records, meeting minutes, board resolutions, special assessment notices, and any documentation related to liens filed against properties in Meadowbrook Estates. I printed it, signed it, and put it in an envelope addressed to Patricia Whitmore at the HOA management address, listed in the covenants. I'd drop it off in person tomorrow, partly to ensure she couldn't claim she never received it, and partly because I wanted to see her face when she realized I wasn't backing down. The next morning was Saturday, which meant no work and no school, just the slow, lazy rhythm of weekend mornings with kids. We made pancakes together, Nolan measuring ingredients and Priya stirring the batter, and for a little while I let myself forget about HOAs and fraud and citations. These moments were what mattered, the ordinary rituals of family life that we'd had to rebuild from scratch after Sarah died. After breakfast, I told the kids I had a quick errand to run, and I drove the 3 blocks to Patricia Whitmore's house with the sealed envelope on my passenger seat. Her home was one of the larger ones in Meadowbrook Estates, a 2-story colonial with perfect landscaping and an American flag hanging from a pole on the front porch. I parked at the curb and walked up the driveway, the envelope in my hand. Patricia answered the door on the second knock, and her expression soured the moment she recognized me. She was exactly what you'd expect from her phone manner. Late 50s, blonde hair sprayed into helmet like perfection, expensive casual clothes that screamed country club membership, and a pinched expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. "Mr. Young," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "what can I do for you?" "I'm delivering a formal records request under Kansas Statute 584606, I said, holding out the envelope. "The HOA has 14 business days to provide the requested documents." She took the envelope like it might bite her, holding it by the corner. "This is highly irregular. Records requests are typically submitted by mail or email. The statute allows for in-person delivery. I wanted to ensure you received it." "I see." She opened the envelope right there in the doorway, pulling out the letter and scanning it with narrowing eyes. "This is quite extensive. Gathering all of this will take considerable time and resources. You have 14 business days. That's what the law allows." Her jaw tightened. "Mr. Young, I don't appreciate your confrontational attitude. The board acts in the best interest of the community, and these constant challenges waste everyone's time and money." "I'm simply exercising my rights as a homeowner," I said evenly. "If the HOA has nothing to hide, providing the records should be straightforward." "We have nothing to hide," she snapped. "But your pattern of behavior is concerning. First you allow your children to violate community standards, and now you're making baseless accusations about impropriety. The board will be discussing your conduct at our next meeting." "I look forward to it," I said. "I'll expect the records within 14 business days." I turned and walked back to my car before she could respond, feeling her glare burning into my back the whole way. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw her still standing in the doorway, the letter clutched in her hand, her face flushed with anger. Good. Let her be angry. Let her scramble to figure out what I was looking for and why. The more defensive she got, the more likely she was to make a mistake. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange tension. I went to work, took care of the kids, maintained the normal routines of our life. But underneath it all, I was waiting for the HOA's response and building my case with Olivia. She called twice to check in, once to ask clarifying questions about the lien amounts, and once just to see how I was holding up under the stress of challenging the board. "You're doing the right thing," she said during that second call, her voice warm over the phone line. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but standing up to this kind of corruption is important. It would be easier if I knew what the end game looks like," I admitted. I was sitting on the back patio after the kids were asleep, the phone pressed to my ear and a beer sweating in my other hand. "If I win this fight, what happens? The board gets replaced, the fees get refunded, or do they just find some other way to retaliate? If we can prove fraud and embezzlement, the board members could face criminal charges," Olivia said. "The AG's office doesn't just slap wrists. We pursue consequences, and the homeowners who were targeted would be entitled to restitution, possibly damages beyond just the fees they paid. And the ones who lost their homes, that's trickier," she admitted. "But if we can show the foreclosures were based on fraudulent liens, there may be legal remedies. It depends on how the properties were sold and whether the new owners were acting in good faith." We talked for another 20 minutes, the conversation drifting from legal strategy to more personal topics. She asked about the kids, how they were handling everything, and I found myself telling her about Priya's nightmares and Nalan's tendency to take on too much responsibility for his age, trying to be the man of the house at 10 years old. She listened without judgment, without offering the empty platitudes that most people defaulted to when they learned I was a widower. "They're lucky to have you," she said finally. "Not every parent would fight this hard for them." "They've already lost their mother," I said. "I'm not going to let some petty tyrant make them feel like they don't belong in their own neighborhood." "Good," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Keep that energy. You're going to need it." On the 14th business day after I delivered the records request, a large envelope arrived in my mailbox with the HOA return address. I took it inside and opened it at the kitchen table, spreading out the contents with growing disbelief. There were financial statements, but only for the current year, with no detail beyond basic categories of income and expenses. There were meeting minutes, but they were sparse summaries that recorded votes without any discussion or context. There were no bank records, no special assessment notices, no documentation of the liens I'd specifically requested. And there was a cover letter from Patricia Whitmore stating that the HOA had provided all records required by law, and that any additional documentation I wanted would require a formal subpoena. I took photos of everything and emailed them to Olivia with a subject line that read, "Inadequate response." She called me within an hour. "This is not compliance with the statute," she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background like she was reviewing the images while we talked. They're required to provide copies of all financial records, including bank statements and check registers. Meeting minutes should include substantive discussion, not just vote tallies, and they can't refuse to provide documentation of liens filed in the HOA's name. "So what do?" I asked. "Now we escalate. I'm going to draft a letter from the AG's office formally notifying the HOA that they're in violation of state disclosure requirements and giving them 7 days to provide complete records. If they still refuse, we'll subpoena the documents directly from their bank and management company. At that point, we'll also open a formal investigation." "How long will that take?" "The investigation could take months," she admitted, "but the subpoenas should come through within a few weeks. In the meantime, I want to interview the other homeowners who were hit with special assessments. Would you be willing to help me reach out to them?" "Of course," I said. "Whatever you need." She paused. "I know this is a lot, Marcus. Most people would have paid the lemonade stand fine and moved on." The fact that you're pursuing this, knowing how much time and energy it's going to take, says something about your character. Or it says I'm stubborn, I said, trying to lighten the mood. Stubborn can be a good thing, she said, and there was warmth in her voice that made something flutter in my chest, an echo of an emotion I thought I'd buried with Sarah. Listen, I'm going to be in Johnson County next week for another case. Would you want to meet for coffee? We can go over the homeowner outreach strategy, and it would be easier to do it in person. Coffee sounds good, I said, keeping my voice casual even though my heart rate had picked up. There's a place in Overland Park I like, Reverie Coffee. Do you know it? I'll find it. How about Wednesday at 10? I'll be there. After we hung up, I sat for a long moment staring at my phone, wondering if I was reading too much into a simple coffee meeting. Olivia was helping me with a legal case. She was a professional doing her job. The fact that she was kind and easy to talk to, and had a smile that made me feel like a person, instead of just a widowed father and struggling homeowner, that didn't mean anything beyond basic human decency. But it had been 18 months since Sarah died. 18 months of focusing entirely on my kids and my work, and just surviving each day. The idea of feeling something for someone else, of making space in my life for anything beyond obligation and grief, felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. I pushed the thought away and focused on the task at hand. There were 3 homeowners I needed to reach out to, 3 families who'd been targeted by the HOA's special assessment scheme. I drafted a careful letter introducing myself, explaining that I was working with the Attorney General's office on an investigation into HOA fee practices, and asking if they'd be willing to share their experiences. I printed 3 copies, signed them, and put them in individual envelopes with my phone number and email address. That evening, after the kids were settled with homework, I walked the neighborhood and hand-delivered the letters. The Patels on Birch weren't home, so I left the envelope in their mailbox. The Kowalskis on Maple answered the door, a tired-looking couple in their 40s with 3 young kids playing in the background. I introduced myself and explained briefly what I was looking into. "You're really investigating the HOA?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper like she was afraid of being overheard. "I'm working with the Attorney General's office," I said. "If you were charged special assessment fees that you didn't vote for or receive proper notice about, that's a violation of state law." "We got a bill for $6,000, she said. "Out of nowhere. They said it was for drainage improvements, but we never saw any work done." When we asked for documentation, Patricia Whitmore threatened to file a lien if we didn't pay within 30 days. We couldn't afford it, so we took out a loan against our house. We're still paying it off. "Would you be willing to talk to someone from the AG's office about that?" I asked. She glanced back at her husband, who had appeared in the hallway behind her. He nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "If it means stopping them from doing this to someone else, yes." I gave her my contact information and Olivia's direct line, thanked her for her time, and headed home feeling like the case was finally gaining momentum. These weren't abstract liens in county records anymore. These were real people with real families who'd been hurt by a corrupt HOA board. The next few days passed quickly. The Patels called me on Sunday afternoon and shared a similar story. $7,000 for road repairs that never happened, threats of foreclosure if they didn't pay, and eventually a lien filed against their property that was only satisfied after they drained their savings. The third family, the Hendersons, were the ones who'd actually lost their house. It took some work to track them down, but I finally found them through a mutual friend who had a forwarding address. I wrote them a longer letter, explaining not just the investigation but how sorry I was that they'd been forced out of their home, and that we were trying to build a case that might result in restitution. I didn't know if they'd respond, didn't know if they'd even want to revisit the trauma of losing their house, but I had to try. Wednesday morning I arrived at Reverie Coffee 10 minutes early, nervous in a way I hadn't been since my first date with Sarah back in college. This wasn't a date, I reminded myself. This was a working meeting with a professional colleague. The fact that I'd changed my shirt 3 times before leaving the house meant nothing. Olivia arrived right at 10, wearing jeans and a lightweight sweater, her hair down around her shoulders instead of pulled back in a ponytail. She looked younger like this, less like a government paralegal and more like someone I might see at the kids' school or the grocery store, just another person living their life. "Hey," she said, smiling as she slid into the chair across from me. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course." "Thanks for coming all the way out here." We ordered coffee, made small talk about the drive and the weather, and then she pulled a folder from her bag and laid it on the table between us. "I've been doing some digging into your HOA board," she said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Patricia Whitmore has been president for 6 years, which is unusually long for an HOA. Most boards have term limits to prevent exactly this kind of concentrated power. But Meadowbrook Estates apparently doesn't have term limits in their governing documents. So she's been running the show unchallenged for 6 years, I said. Exactly. And in that time, according to county records, the HOA has filed liens against 11 different properties for unpaid special assessments. That's 11 families out of a neighborhood of what? 80 homes. 84, I said. So more than 10% of the community has been targeted. That's not normal, Marcus. That's systematic. She pulled out a spreadsheet and turned it so I could see. I mapped out the timeline of liens versus the timeline of violations and complaints. Every single lien was filed within 6 months of the homeowner challenging the board in some way. Every single one. I studied the spreadsheet, my stomach tightening. Seeing it all laid out like this, the pattern was undeniable. This is retaliation. Yes. Which makes it not just fraud, but potentially racketeering if we can show a conspiracy among multiple board members. She leaned forward, her expression intense. I'm going to need to interview all 11 families, the 3 you've already contacted plus the 8 others. Can you help me reach them? I can try, I said, but some of them might not want to talk. The Hendersons lost their house. I don't know if they'll want to relive that. I understand. But their testimony is crucial if we're going to build a criminal case. She paused, her expression softening. How are you holding up with all this? I know it's a lot. I'm okay, I said automatically, then reconsidered. Actually, I'm angry. I keep thinking about my kids crying on the curb and the Kowalskis taking out a loan they couldn't afford and the Hendersons losing their home. And I think about how many people probably just paid the fines and assessments rather than fight because it seemed easier. Patricia Whitmore has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, and everyone just accepted it. Not everyone, Olivia said quietly. You didn't accept it. Only because she came after my kids. That's how it starts, she said. Someone does something so egregious that you can't ignore it anymore, and then you pull the thread and the whole rotten sweater unravels. She smiled, a small wry expression. Sorry, that's a terrible metaphor. No, it's accurate, I said, smiling back. I just hope the sweater actually unravels instead of just getting tangled. We spent the next hour going over the strategy for reaching out to the other homeowners, drafting a template letter that Olivia could send on official AG letterhead, and discussing what evidence we'd need to prove embezzlement beyond just the fraudulent fees. If Patricia Whitmore and the other board members had personally profited from the special assessments, There would be a money trail somewhere, deposits into personal accounts or unexplained expenses that didn't match the HOA's stated purposes. "I've subpoenaed the HOA's bank records," Olivia said. "We should have those within 2 weeks. Once we can see where the money actually went, we'll know if this is just fraud or if it crosses into criminal embezzlement." "What are the chances she's been dumb enough to deposit HOA funds into her personal account?" I asked. "You'd be surprised how often that happens," Olivia said. "People who commit fraud often aren't criminal masterminds. They're just opportunistic and arrogant enough to think they won't get caught." As we were wrapping up, Olivia hesitated, then said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," I said, curious. "Your wife, Sarah. You mentioned she passed away. Was it recent?" 18 months ago," I said. "Car accident. She was driving home from work and someone ran a red light." "I'm so sorry," Olivia said, and there was genuine empathy in her eyes, not pity. "That must be incredibly hard, raising 2 kids alone." "It is," I admitted. "But they're good kids and we're figuring it out. Some days are harder than others." "I can't imagine," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "The reason I ask is because I want to make sure I'm not overstepping. This case is important to me professionally, but I also genuinely like you and your family. And I don't want you to feel like I'm being inappropriate or taking advantage of a professional relationship." My heart did a complicated thing in my chest, something between a skip and a lurch. "Are you saying you'd like to see me outside of work?" I asked carefully. "I'm saying I'd like to get to know you better," she said. "If that's something you're open to. No pressure, and it doesn't affect the case either way. I'm going to pursue this investigation regardless. But I thought I should be honest about where my head is." I looked at her across the table, at the warm brown eyes and the genuine smile, and the person who'd taken a random email from a stranger seriously enough to respond within minutes and meet the next day. I thought about the coffee meeting that felt like more than just work, and the way she'd asked about my kids not as an obligation but because she actually cared. "I'd like that," I said. "Getting to know you better, I mean. It's been a long time since I've even thought about something like this, so I'm probably going to be awkward and out of practice. But yes, I'd like that." Her smile widened into something that made my chest feel lighter. "I can work with awkward and out of practice." We exchanged personal cell numbers, made tentative plans to have dinner once the investigation hit a natural pause point, and parted ways with a warmth between us that felt like the beginning of something good. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in 18 months, hopeful. Not just about the HOA case, but about the possibility of building a life that included more than just grief and obligation. The next week brought movement on multiple fronts. The AG's office sent the formal letter to the HOA demanding complete financial records. And this time, the letter came with the weight of state authority and the threat of subpoenas if compliance wasn't immediate. Olivia began interviewing the homeowners who'd been hit with special assessments, and each conversation added another layer to the case. And then, on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner, and the kids were doing homework at the kitchen table, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Mr. Young, this is Daniel Henderson. You sent me a letter about the HOA investigation." I stepped out onto the patio, closing the sliding door behind me. "Mr. Henderson, thank you for calling. I know this must be difficult to talk about. My wife and I lost our home because of that woman," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "We'd lived there for 12 years. We raised our kids there. And Patricia Whitmore took it from us over a fake $7,000 fee for road repairs that never happened. So yes, I want to talk. I want to do whatever it takes to make sure she faces consequences. I gave him Olivia's contact information and promised that the AG's office would follow up within 24 hours. After we hung up, I stood on the patio for a long moment, feeling the weight of what we were building. This wasn't just about a lemonade stand anymore, or even about holding a petty tyrant accountable. This was about 11 families who'd been systematically targeted and defrauded, about people who'd lost their homes, or drained their savings, or taken on debt they couldn't afford because someone in a position of minor authority had decided they could get away with it. The HOA's bank records arrived at the AG's office 3 weeks after the initial subpoena, and Olivia called me that evening with excitement barely contained in her voice. "Marcus, we found it. The money trail is right here in black and white." "Tell me," I said, already pulling up a notepad to take notes. Over the last 5 years, the HOA collected approximately $190,000 in special assessment fees from various homeowners. According to the bank records, $73,000 of that went into the HOA's operating account, which is accounted for in their public financial statements. But the remaining $117,000 went into a separate account that's not disclosed anywhere in the HOA's records. "Where did that money go?" I asked. "That's the beautiful part." Patricia Whitmore is a co-signer on that account, along with the HOA treasurer, a man named Robert Finch, and over the past 5 years, they've made regular withdrawals from that account totaling $94,000. The withdrawals are for administrative expenses and management fees, but there's no corresponding documentation showing what those expenses actually were. "So they've been pocketing the money," I said. "That's what it looks like. And that's embezzlement, Marcus. That's a felony charge." She paused and I could hear papers rustling. "I'm taking this to my supervisor tomorrow. With the bank records, the homeowner testimony, and the pattern of retaliation, we have enough to recommend criminal charges. This is going to move quickly now." "How quickly?" I asked. "The AG will likely open a formal criminal investigation within a week. They'll bring in the fraud unit and potentially coordinate with local law enforcement. If Whitmore and Finch are smart, they'll hire lawyers and try to negotiate a plea. If they're not, this goes to trial." "What about the homeowners? Do they get their money back?" "That will be part of the restitution phase. Once we have criminal charges, we can also pursue civil remedies on behalf of the affected homeowners. They'll get their money back, plus damages for the harm caused. It won't undo what happened to the Hendersons, but it's something." We talked for another 30 minutes, Olivia walking me through the next steps and what to expect as the case moved from investigation to prosecution. When we finally hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the kids already asleep upstairs, and felt the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally catching up with Patricia Whitmore. The formal announcement came 2 weeks later. The Kansas Attorney General held a press conference announcing criminal charges against Patricia Whitmore and Robert Finch for embezzlement, fraud, and violations of Kansas consumer protection statutes. The charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 10 years, along with restitution requirements that would force them to repay every dollar they'd stolen, plus damages and penalties. I watched the press conference online, and seeing Patricia Whitmore's face on the screen, her expression stony and defensive as she was led into the courthouse for her arraignment, gave me a grim satisfaction. This was the woman who'd knocked over my kid's lemonade stand and made my daughter cry. This was the woman who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood for years, weaponizing her position to enrich herself at the expense of families just trying to live their lives. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, I was fielding calls from reporters wanting to know about the lemonade stand that had sparked the investigation. I kept my comments brief, redirecting them to the AG's office and emphasizing that this wasn't about me. It was about the 11 families who'd been targeted and the systemic corruption that had gone unchecked for too long. Olivia called me the evening after the arraignment. "You did it," she said. "You pulled the thread and the whole sweater unraveled." "We did it," I corrected. "I couldn't have gotten here without you." "I'm just doing my job," she said, but there was warmth in her voice. Although I have to admit, this case became a lot more personal than most of the work I do. "Because of the kids?" I asked. "Because of you," she said quietly. "And yes, because of the kids. Because of all of it, really. This was the kind of case that reminds me why I do this work." We talked for a while longer, and before we hung up, she asked if I wanted to have that dinner we discussed weeks ago. I said yes, without hesitation. The trial moved faster than I expected. Patricia Whitmore and Robert Finch both rejected plea deals, apparently convinced they could argue that the special assessments were legitimate and that they'd done nothing wrong. It was a miscalculation that would cost them dearly. The trial lasted a week, and I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with the other homeowners who'd been targeted. Olivia was there as a witness and expert on HOA law, and watching her testify about the pattern of fraud and the clear violations of Kansas statute was impressive. She was calm, articulate, and devastatingly thorough. The defense tried to argue that the special assessments were for legitimate expenses, and that the separate bank account was simply an organizational tool to keep the funds separate from regular operating costs. But the prosecution methodically dismantled that argument, showing that there was no documentation of any work done, no contracts with vendors, no receipts or invoices that matched the claimed expenses. The money had simply vanished into Patricia Whitmore's and Robert Finch's pockets. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Sentencing came 2 months later. Patricia Whitmore received 7 years in prison and was ordered to pay $200,000 in restitution to the affected homeowners. Robert Finch received 5 years and a similar restitution order. Both were also permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in Kansas. I stood on the courthouse steps after the sentencing with the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, the Patels, and 8 other families who'd been victimized. We weren't celebrating exactly, but there was a sense of closure, of justice finally being served. The Hendersons had tears in their eyes, and Mrs. Henderson hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not letting them get away with it." "I'm sorry it took your home for someone to notice," I said. "But someone did notice," she said. "You noticed and you fought back. That matters." In the weeks after the trial, life slowly returned to normal, or at least to a new version of normal that included regular dinners with Olivia and her growing presence in my life and my kids' lives. She was patient with them, never trying to replace their mother but making space for herself as someone who cared about them and wanted to be part of their world. Priya started smiling more, and Nalan relaxed his too serious grip on responsibility, letting himself be a kid again. One Saturday afternoon in late August, as summer was winding down and school was about to start, Nalan and Priya asked if they could set up another lemonade stand. I said yes immediately, helping them haul the card table out to the corner of our yard and mixing up a batch of lemonade while they made signs and set out cups. This time, though, the stand lasted all afternoon. Neighbors stopped by, buying cup after cup and dropping extra dollars in the tip jar the kids had optimistically set out. Mrs. Chen came with a plate of cookies to sell alongside the lemonade. The Kowalskis brought their kids to help. Even some of the reporters who'd covered the trial stopped by to take photos and buy lemonade from the kids whose stand had brought down a corrupt HOA board. Olivia showed up around 3, carrying a poster board she decorated with the kids' names and bright drawings of lemons. She helped them tape it to the front of the table, then bought a cup of lemonade and sat on the curb with me, watching the kids laugh and negotiate prices with customers and count their growing pile of cash. "This is what it should have been the first time," she said quietly. "Yeah," I agreed. "This is what childhood should look like, happy and normal and full of lemonade stands." She leaned against my shoulder, a casual, comfortable gesture that felt like coming home. "You're a good dad, Marcus." "I'm trying," I said. "That's all any of us can do, right? Just try our best and hope it's enough." "It's enough," she said. "Trust me, it's enough." By the time the sun started to set, the kids had made $73, which they split between themselves with solemn seriousness, before announcing they were going to donate half of it to a charity that helped families who'd lost their homes. I didn't tell them that was unnecessary, didn't point out that they'd earned that money and could spend it however they wanted. Instead, I just hugged them both and told them I was proud of them. That evening, after the kids were in bed and Olivia and I were sitting on the back patio with glasses of wine, she said, "I got a call from the AG's office today. The restitution payments have been processed. Every homeowner who was charged fraudulent fees is getting their money back, plus additional damages." "Including the Hendersons?" I asked. "Especially the Hendersons. They're getting enough to cover a down payment on a new house, along with compensation for the harm they suffered." I raised my glass. "To justice actually working the way it's supposed to." "To justice," she agreed, clinking her glass against mine, "and to stubborn paralegals who don't know when to quit." "I learned from the best," I said, smiling at her. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the summer night warm and full of cricket sounds. Eventually, Olivia said, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," I said. "Where do you see this going? Us, I mean. I know it's only been a few months, and I know you're still healing from losing Sarah. I'm not trying to rush anything. I just want to make sure we're on the same page." I thought about how to answer, about how to explain that grief didn't have a timeline or an expiration date, that I would always love Sarah and always carry the loss of her with me. But I also thought about how life had a way of surprising you, of offering second chances when you least expected them, of showing you that it was possible to honor the past while still building a future. "I see this going somewhere good," I said finally. "I see you becoming a bigger part of our lives if that's what you want. I see my kids having someone else who cares about them. I see me being happy again in a way I didn't think was possible after Sarah died." "That's what I want too," she said softly. "All of it." "Then let's take it one day at a time," I said. "No pressure, no rush, just see where it goes." "One day at a time," she agreed. The rest of that summer and into the fall, we did exactly that. We took it slow, building a relationship that respected my grief and my kids' needs while still allowing space for something new and good to grow. Olivia became a regular presence at our dinner table, at school events, at the small moments that make up a life. The kids adored her, and she treated them with a gentleness and respect that made my heart ache in the best way. The HOA elected a new board, one that actually followed the rules and treated homeowners like partners instead of subjects. The Hendersons bought a new house 3 streets over from where their old one had been, determined to stay in the neighborhood despite everything that had happened. And my kids' lemonade stand became something of a local legend. The stand that brought down a corrupt HOA and reminded everyone that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can lead to the biggest changes. On a cool October afternoon, as leaves were starting to turn and the air carried the first hint of autumn chill, I stood in my driveway and looked at my house, my neighborhood, my life, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Content. Not happy in the uncomplicated way I'd been happy before Sarah died, but content in the deeper way that comes from surviving something hard and coming out the other side with new scars and new wisdom and new people to love. Nalan was in the yard raking leaves into piles that Priya immediately jumped into, their laughter carrying across the neighborhood. Olivia was in the kitchen starting dinner, comfortable enough in our space now that she didn't ask permission before opening cabinets or using the stove. And I was standing in the space between them, the father and the man and the person who'd learned that standing up for what was right mattered, even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to just pay the fine and move on. The lemonade stand sat folded in the garage, waiting for next summer when the kids would inevitably want to set it up again. And when they did, I'd help them mix the lemonade and make the signs and sit on the curb watching them negotiate with customers and count their money. Because that's what childhood should be, full of lemonade stands and small acts of entrepreneurship and parents who fight for them when the world tries to tell them they don't belong. Patricia Whitmore was in prison, where she'd spend the next 7 years thinking about the choices that had led her there. Robert Finch was in a different facility, his own sentence a reminder that enabling corruption was just as culpable as committing it. And 11 families who'd been targeted and defrauded had their money back, their dignity restored, their faith in justice at least partially renewed. It had started with a citation taped to an overturned lemonade stand and a pitcher spilled across the sidewalk. It had started with my daughter crying on the curb and my son asking if they were in trouble. It had started with my anger and my determination not to let them be punished for doing something innocent and joyful. And it had ended with justice served, with a community healed, with new relationships built and old wounds beginning to scar over. It had ended with my kids learning that standing up for yourself mattered, that fighting back against bullies was worth the effort, that their father would go to war for them every single time. That evening, after dinner and homework and the comfortable chaos of family life, after Olivia had gone home with a kiss and a promise to see me tomorrow, after the kids were tucked in and the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photo I kept there of Sarah. She was smiling in the picture, her arm around me, both of us younger and unaware of what was coming. "I hope you'd be proud of us," I said to the photo, to her memory, to the ghost of the life we'd planned together. "I hope you'd think I'm doing okay with the kids. I hope you'd like Olivia because I think you would. She's good for us." There was no answer, of course. There never was. But sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, I felt at peace with the choices I'd made, with the fight I'd fought, with the new life I was building from the wreckage of the old one. The lemonade stand would come out again next summer. The kids would make their signs and mix their lemonade and learn the small lessons of entrepreneurship and responsibility. And this time, no one would knock over their table or tell them they didn't belong. This time, they'd spend a long afternoon selling lemonade to neighbors who supported them, in a neighborhood that had learned the hard way what happened when good people stood up to corruption. And I'd sit on the curb and watch them, maybe with Olivia beside me, and I'd remember the day that started it all. The overturned table, the spilled lemonade, the citation that changed everything. I'd remember being angry and scared and determined, and I'd remember that sometimes the smallest injustices reveal the biggest ones, and that pulling one thread can unravel an entire corrupt system. But mostly, I'd remember that I was a father first, and that everything else, all the legal battles and investigations and court proceedings, all of it came back to those two kids on the curb, crying because someone had told them they didn't belong. They belonged. They'd always belonged. And I'd spent months proving that to them, to the neighborhood, to the HOA that thought it could bully its way through life without consequences. The citation was still in my files somewhere, kept as a reminder of where we'd started. The lemonade stand was in the garage, waiting. And my kids were upstairs sleeping, safe and loved and living in a world that was just a tiny bit more just because their father had decided to fight back. That was enough. That had to be enough. And on a cool October night in Johnson County, Kansas, with autumn settling in and winter waiting ahead, it felt like more than enough. It felt like everything.